Are you ready for an amazing chapter that people have misread, misconstrued, misapplied, misdirected to the point where they have created these vast fantasies, grabbing a little bit out of the Apocrypha era Daniel, in other words, the last half of that book, and then some of these symbols out of Revelation and ram them all together with this chapter to make this elaborate, very dramatic, left behind type stuff about our future. And wouldn't you know it, whenever they do all of this, they find out one salient fact, and that is we're living right now in the last days. Can't you see the signs are all around us? Here's the problem. Those passages don't belong together. That's one. Two, almost every generation since the time of Jesus has pulled this stunt and claimed, look around you, can't you tell that we're now living in the last days? How many times does a little boy cry wolf before the people don't respond? Well, if he's crying, these are the last days, so far, it's up into the many hundreds of times, and people are still running out and buying the books. Now, some of these people that write the books are good friends of mine, and I dearly love them, and I have huge respect for them, but they have a blind spot in this. We have this craving for drama that our generation, all of the history of humankind, must be culminating in us right now at this moment. Every election is the most important election that we have ever had. Every debate, the most important debate that has ever been done. And now in our church times, we look about and we see fluffy clouds going across and we go, it is the end of the world. We can tell the Antichrist is everywhere. After a while, you have to ask, how many times does a little boy cry wolf and you still run out thinking you're going to see a wolf? Wonder why we have this great need to be special and have drama. I don't know why, but we absolutely do. I think that it gives us, it's a cheap way of finding meaning and purpose. Instead of studying, working hard, picking up the hammer, picking up the book, whatever you need to do to give your life direction and make it productive. No, it's a lot easier to listen to TV preachers scare you about a red cow's going to be born somewhere, therefore the end of the world's coming. And, I read one of the latest books. I'd been told by people, you got to read this. So I put my money into it. I knew it was probably going to be a disappointment. Within about 30 pages, I realized I've read this book before, but it used to be called The Late Great Planet Earth. And then it was called all these other books, all the Left Behind stuff. No, I don't believe in an elaborate grabbing of all of these different symbols, running them together, taking this one literally, this one not, this one literally, this one not, and then making this chunky stew out of it. I believe that our job is to love God and love our neighbor, take care of the poor, look after the widows and orphans, share what we have, live like Jesus, act like Jesus, look like Jesus. It's not my job to know the future, and it's not my job to be afraid of the future. It's my job to do what Christ told us to do. And this chapter 24, the book of Matthew, is going to deal with that. Now, by the way, if you wonder what I do think about those symbols in the book of Revelation, that's actually the first set of videos that we put up on this channel 4 years ago this week. Yes, our safe harbor has now hit its 4th birthday. And we put up these videos. Now you can go get them even to this date. There are no notes attached to them because, like these Wednesday classes, I work just off the text. However, and also just a wee warning, we were given an office for the first year and a half so that we could get our legs under us as we started our safe harbor. Thank you, Jeremy. The light in there is not great. The audio is not great because they pumped in white noise. It was in a company. I had an office in this big area of company that dealt with cybersecurity, and therefore they had to have white noise and some security things that messed up the audio, but you can understand it. It's just not going to be as plain and clear as our videos are today. But you can go back and look at that, and they're all free. They're all still up there, as well as about 1,000 other videos in the last 4 years. Wow. Anyway, Are you ready? We're going to read this, but I want you to pay very close attention to what is said. Not what you think is said, not what you've been told was said, not what you assume he meant, none of this. Who is speaking? To whom are they speaking? Why are they speaking? When are they speaking? Let's take the when. If you remember, Jesus is now in the last week of his earthly life before the cross. He is nearing his arrest, in fact. This week, what has he been doing? He's been coming into town. He's been staying outside in Bethany, but coming into town every day and challenging the Pharisees, the priests, the teachers of the law, the scribes, the Sadducees, right in the temple. He has been bringing it to them, and they've been coming back with everything they've got, and he has been just shoving off this one and the other, verbally destroying them. And yet it's like the disciples have to feel like that there have been a game of dodgem cars or whack-a-mole, and they're the only thing out there without a hammer or a car, because it's just been, they're coming from all directions. Now Jesus has handled it, but where's it going to come to next? Jesus has just now finished absolutely blasting the Pharisees in Matthew 23, a chapter that has language that would absolutely stun you if your picture of Jesus in your head or in your heart is a 2D cartoon instead of a real living being who had real feelings and who needed to bring the heat from time to time. So, chapter 24, they're walking away from that huge, powerful, loud, angry encounter. Now, wasn't angry on the part of Jesus, probably. He was being very straightforward. You can call it righteous anger if you want to. I'm not going to quibble with you on that. But the Pharisees would have been very angry. The crowd would have been laughing some of the time. It was a raucous day. Now, Matthew 24, Jesus left the temple and was walking away when his disciples came up to call his attention to the buildings. What's going on? Okay, where are we and when are we? When, you've just heard. Where are we? We're in the temple environs, around the temple. What's going on? Why would they be pointing out the buildings? Well, Herod the Great wasn't great. He was a terrible person. History knows that. I mean, there's nobody who's a Herod fan today that I've ever met in my life or read about. Killed his own family. He would do whatever it took. He was very much like the worst of the Roman emperors, but he was a sub-king under them. But you couldn't push your people too far or there wouldn't be peace, and Rome would just come in and kill you and put in somebody else. So to pacify the Jews, and he was kind of Jewish and kind of not. He certainly was not pure blood Jew, nor was he Orthodox. He was not observant. Yet to pacify them, he had done this multi-year, actually multi-decade, refurbishing of the temple grounds and the buildings around. And the people were very impressed with these wonderful buildings. Excuse me. Been talking all day. Can you tell? Jesus, whenever they're saying, look at this, he goes, do you see all these things? I tell you the truth. Not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down. Just when the disciples had about all they could handle. Yeah, Jesus came out on the winning side of all the arguments there, but probably that's better seen from a distance than what they're feeling right now. It's like, when's the next angry email coming in? When's the next angry tweet coming in? So they're stunned. They don't say anything. Later, Jesus has walked on now, and he sat down on the Mount of Olives. As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. You can tell they've been thinking about this. You ask him. No, you ask him. One of those. So they just kind of ease up there. Tell us, they said, when will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? We have 2 questions, minimum. You can say 3. When are those buildings going to get knocked down? Now, that's a huge concern of theirs, because the temple was where God lived. It was a center of Jewish life. It was where you went to meet Yahweh and to have your sins forgiven and It was huge and important. And yet it had been knocked down before. This temple was not Solomon's temple and Zerubbabel's temple. This is Herod's and what they had been able to rebuild out of the last two, and it was nothing like Solomon's. Each iteration wasn't as good as the one before, from what I understand. And today, by the way, there's not one stone upon another. It is now where a mosque is. If you read about the history of Jerusalem, you will find out that those buildings kept getting torn down and the building blocks, materials being reused elsewhere. Then those would be torn down. And it went on forever and has gone on since this time. That it has never been at peace the way we would like for people to be at peace. But when will this happen? What's going to, when will all of our buildings go away? Now, 2, what will be the sign of your coming? Most people look upon this as one question. What will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? The end of the age here would indicate what most of us say is the end of the world. The Bible really talks about it being the end of the world, but it doesn't use the word terra. It uses the word eos, which means not the place, but the way the world does things. In other words, when will God renew the earth? When will Christ come back and establish, heaven, kingdom, however you want to put it? When will he rule, in fact, as he rules by law now? So you have at least 2 questions. You could divide them if you wanted to into when will these buildings fall down? What are the signs of your coming? And what about the end of the age? You can do that because the coming of the day of the Lord, or the day of the Lord, or the day of Yahweh, in your Old Testaments, if you read and you come across the word Lord and they're all capitals, that means Yahweh. We do not know how to pronounce the 4 consonants to make up the name of Jesus. Of God. That has been lost over time. And so all they've done is they've taken the 4 consonants and then they've taken the vowels from Adonai and put them in there. So if somebody tells you, don't call him God or Jehovah, his name is Yahweh, they're making it up. They don't know. Nobody knows. God just says, whatever name you use for him, don't take it in vain. So what does it mean when we keep finding these, the day of the Lord, the day of the Lord? Judgment, justice, God breaking into human history. Usually there is violence involved, a captivity into Assyria, captivity into Babylon, the fall of Assyria or Babylon, the fall of the northern tribes. All of these things, whenever God moves, finally says, all right, I'm hitting a big reset button and we're changing things, is a day of the Lord. So yes, is the end of the last day before earth and all of its elements are refined with fire. Is that what we're talking about? Could be, but it's also been other days. Are you confused? We'll help you out. Hang in there, all right? We won't get through it all today, but we're going to get through enough of it to help you kind of get a grasp on this. And please remember, to the Christian, fear is never an option, and love is never optional. Hang in there. We don't need the drama. Just open your eyes and look around and see somebody who needs help and love them in the name of Jesus. That's what we're supposed to be doing. All right? In the meantime, Jesus answered, watch out that no one deceives you. I thank him for that. The first thing out of his mouth is, there are going to be a whole lot of people trying to fool you about what I'm about to say. And yes, the books have been written and written and written. And the seminars, we're holding a Revelation end of days seminar. Everybody runs out because they want to see how long they've got. He says, don't let anybody deceive you. For many will come in my name, claiming, I am the Christ, or Messiah. By the way, and deceive many. By the way, we have some record of that, mainly through Josephus, but other false Christ tried to rise up and say, no, it's me. And many of us who lived through the 60s and 70s and remember before airports were secure areas, that the Hare Krishnas and the Unification Church and all the other would flood into the airport and try to sell you books, and really quite aggressively. the Unification Church of South Korea with Sun Myung Moon, he claimed to be a new iteration of the Christ. And he's not alone. There have been others who have as well. He said, they will say, I am the Christ, and deceive many. You'll hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. There are going to be wars, but that's nothing. It's always going to be there. Don't be alarmed. I guarantee you that those in America right now, whoever won the election, who are panicking that their person didn't win, and who think this must mean the end of time is coming, I guarantee you, you're not going under the stress of somebody in Poland, Czechoslovakia, France during World War II, or in France during World War I. I guarantee you, your world's not falling apart like theirs was. So why was their war not the end of the world? In fact, they even thought World War I was the war to end all wars. How'd that work out? It just doesn't, does it? Jesus says these are always going to happen. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of birth pains. It's a very Semitic thing. We don't talk like that last line. It just means this is the way the world goes. You're going to have earthquakes. I can remember when Disney World down in Florida, I believe this was the early 80s or late 70s, had their first official gay week, day, whatever it was. And a lot of Christians got very, very upset at this. Of course, if you're taking your little kids there and you're concerned about what they're going to be doing or something, but a lot of Christians really got upset about this. And Pat Robertson, a very famous TV preacher of the time, and for a long time, he came on and said that God had given him this vision that because Disney World had done this, that God was going to strike Florida with hurricanes. I'm going to let you just sit there for a minute. Think about that one. Florida gets hurricanes. They had them well before there was a Disney World, and we're still having them. Jesus says there are going to be earthquakes. There are going to be wars. There's going to be famines. All of these are the beginning of birth pains. Do you remember that Paul says all creation is groaning in birth pains, waiting to be delivered by Christ? Well, yeah, tectonic plates are going to slip. There are going to be earthquakes. There are going to be climate changes. There always have been climate changes. There are going to be ice ages. There are going to be ice sheet retreats ages. There are going to be all of this. Now, that doesn't mean that we who are supposed to be stewards of the earth don't pay attention to pollution and doing what we can to make things nice and pretty. But it does mean that we don't interpret everything as super drama into the world. He says, you will be handed over to be persecuted and put to death. You'll be hated by all nations because of me. By the way, those of you outside of America, I'll have to explain this a bit. There's a department store, very nice store, called Target. It's all over the U.S. I believe that it's in Canada as well, but I'm not really sure. They've got Canadian Tire, so they're pretty well set up there. But Target, and for reasons that I'm not exactly sure why, they decided several Christmases ago not to let the Salvation Army collect money over Christmas. The Salvation Army would come and they'd set up these big kettles and they would ring a bell, Christmas bell, and people would come and they'd put their change in, and that money goes to support the social welfare programs that the Salvation Army has done for a very long time all over America and elsewhere. But for some reason, Target decided not to do that, and people began to yell, we're being persecuted. Really? That's not persecution. It's not. Persecution's a lot worse than that. You're not going to be being put to death by this. You'll be hated by all of the nations because of me. And at that time, many will turn away from the faith and will betray and hate each other. Many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. Because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold. but he who stands firm to the end will be saved. And this is the gospel, and this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. First of all, the gospel has to be preached to all nations. Then the end will come. Which end? Well, he hasn't really started answering the end of time question yet. He's still talking about the end of these buildings question. When will the gospel be preached to all nations? Well, please remember that they do not use exact language like we demand in our discussions and our writings. When Peter stood up with the rest of the apostles and preached in Acts chapter 2, take a look at the list of nations from whom Jews had come to gather on that day and all the different language groups that assembled in one area. Yeah, the gospel was preached and it was spread out from Jerusalem, with them returning home, taking it to all the nations, which meant all the known nations to them. And the Gentiles received the word after Acts chapter 10, whenever Cornelius is converted. And then it goes out through there. And so this, please remember, Paul talks about he traveled the whole world and that the gospel had been preached to the whole world. Well, he's not talking about Uruguay or Singapore. They're talking about their world, the world they knew. And so Jesus is saying the gospel will be preached to all the nations, but the end will come. When you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let me tell you what is going to happen less than 40 years after Jesus is talking here. It's closer to 35 years. There will be a time where the Romans will decide that they've had enough of the Jewish people rebelling, dragging their feet in obedience, and they decide they have just to quash this. And at this time, there are going to be a whole bunch of emperors that rise and fall. Some of them don't last as long as one of the old light bulbs did. But then the army will be sent. When the army is sent, the Roman army comes with its standard, and the standard is lifted high, and it's the eagle. You need to remember the eagle. We're going to talk about the eagle again. Other than eagle, what else should we look for? Well, verse 15 says that we should look for the abomination of desolation that stands in the holy place. That is your warning that you've got to get out of there quickly. Well, what is that? That seems to be rather important, except that it isn't to us, because he was answering the first question. They saw him look at the buildings, and he said, these will not have one stone upon another. They'll be completely destroyed. These buildings that are still being constructed that you are so proud of will completely be knocked down. And they said, well, when is this going to be? And the eagle is part of it, but he also talks about the abomination of desolation. So he's talking to them. In fact, if you look at the book of Revelation and you just decide to circle the number of times in the first few chapters alone that he says this will shortly come to pass, it'll soon happen. He's talking to them immediately, not about, hey, some people a few thousand years from now are going to have some political upheaval and there might be a war, and that's what this book is about. How in the world would that comfort them? That would give them no comfort at all. He's giving them a spiritual overlay of what it looks like to be fighting between Christians and the Christian life and the governments that try to rule us instead. And so again, I'm not calling for the overthrow of any government. That's not the point. The point is that many Christians, in fact, they would do so within a couple hundred years, will link arms with the state to the point where you're just not a Christian if you don't vote our way. And then they grab the power of the state to enforce their will. And the book of Revelation is an argument and really a diatribe against that in apocalyptic literature form. Well, in verse 15, that abomination of desolation is lifted from the book of Daniel. Now, the book of Daniel is really two books. They're so very different. The first part of the book is the adventure of Daniel and his faithfulness in the lion's den and his visions for Nebuchadnezzar and etc. But then suddenly it takes a very hard shift into very deep, convoluted apocalyptic literature. Now, an apocalyptic literature means it is in symbolic terms, it is hidden, it's esoteric. You have to dig in there and know the symbols and meanings and such. And it's very complex. And because of this, there have been many premillennial theories, pre-trib and post-trib, and so many. But all of those act as if this book was, and Jesus' answer, was designed to talk to us in 2024 or any one of the last generations, all the way up through even the Montanist, which would arise less than 100 years later. I think I'm right. It might be 200 years later. Were actually kicked out of the church because they grabbed all these visions and applied them to their time. And the early church said, no, it's for all time and it's not to be read literally. But we do it, and people have done it throughout history. So what is an abomination of desolation? If we take all the literature together, and we're trying to stay with just Jesus stories, so we're not getting deep into theology today, it is anything which is an abomination brought into the temple that destroys the ability to worship. And the Romans, when they entered Jerusalem, killed indiscriminately. The slaughter was horrific. And they intentionally went into the temple and they slaughtered their animals on the altars and they desecrated it and then they tore it up. That's the abomination that causes desolation, as some versions read. Because of that, Jesus is warning them. Their entire system is coming down. Not that God doesn't like the Jews anymore. Of course he loves the Jews. And of course we do too. It is instead the entire system that they had developed and that they were trying to protect, even at the cost of killing the one they knew was the Messiah. Not the Jews as a whole, but the top religious leaders who conspired among themselves to kill Christ. They knew the parable of the vineyard. Do you remember that very recently in our stories? They knew who he was, but they thought he always forgives us. God always forgives us. He'll still give us the vineyard. And Jesus is saying, your entire system will be brought down. You will no longer exist as the people you've always been. And it is impossible today to worship according to the Levitical system, the system in Deuteronomy. None of this. Why? Because the altar is gone, the Holy of Holies is gone, the temple is gone. Understanding who's a member of what tribe is gone. All of these things are gone. You cannot replicate them. You cannot, by your will, decide to bring them back into being. And so now Christ has kept telling them, my Father has sheep and other sheepfolds, and he's going to bring them all together, Jews and Gentiles all together. He does not replace the Jews. The replacement theory is wrong. He brings us all together. But he goes on, then, if you see this, he says, if you see the abomination, if you see this coming, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Now, he's not talking about the end of the world here, because of what possible use would that be? Let's run to the mountains. No, it's get out of there. Let no one on the roof of his house go down to take anything out of the house. Think of it as like a tsunami. When a tsunami is coming and you see, first of all, the water has gone out and now the water is coming back. You don't have time. I need to go get my wallet. You don't have time. I need to go get my dog. You don't have time. You either turn and run right now or you're dead. That's what he's saying. When you see this coming, run. Don't hesitate. Run. Let no one in the field go back to get his cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that your flight not take place in winter or on the Sabbath, which makes travel difficult. And yes, they really do have winters over there. And on the Sabbath, there was a limit to how long they were supposed to walk. I know God would have forgiven them for running further, but the Sabbath, many Jews would not travel, period. In fact, the Muslims learned this early in Jewish history, and they learned to attack on the Sabbath because the Jews were worshiping. It took a while for the Jews to decide they needed to be able to fight on the Sabbath. And by the way, the Romans did the same thing to the Maccabees. And so he's saying, just pray that your flight not be then, for there will be great distress, unequaled, from the beginning of the world until now, never to be equaled again. Well, not talking about the end of the world. He's talking about the end of the entire system that they had known for, we can plug in a number here, 1,000 years, 1,300 years. If those days had not been cut short, no one would survive, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. In other words, this grinding war will not continue and continue and continue. In fact, the Romans intended for it to. But once again, palace intrigues back in Rome would recall the generals back to Rome to make sure that their favorite general and their favorite emperor could get together and form a government there. And so their intention was to wipe the Jews from the earth, but what they did is they wiped Jerusalem functionally off the earth for a time, and that scattered the Jews. And the word for that in history is diaspora. And the great diaspora of the Jews, they scattered and they took their worship of Yahweh with them, and many of them were Christians. So they took the word of Jesus with them as well. He warns, if at any time someone says, look, here's the Christ, or there he is, don't believe it. For false Christ and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and miracles to deceive even the elect, if that were possible. See, I've told you ahead of time. So if anyone tells you, he is here out in the desert, don't go out. Or he is here in the inner rooms, don't believe it. For as lightning that comes from the east is visible even in the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Again, the coming of the Son of Man, the coming of the day of the Lord. These are phrases of times of judgment. The judgment is coming that fast. And look what he says in verse 28. Wherever there is a carcass, there the vultures will gather. You know, the word vulture there is often translated eagles. The standards on the Romans, big pole with the long tapestry coming down and the number of the legion on there. These standards were topped by an eagle. Hitler copied that. A lot of places have tried to copy that and tried to be the new kind of Roman Empire. And as they marched in, there will be carcasses. And immediately after the distress of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. Now, a lot of folk will say, well, that's plainly the end of the universe. No. It's poetic language extremely common in Semitic peoples. That means the dissolution of all government, rule, and authority. You will have no courts of appeal. You cannot call for help. There won't be any. It would be as if I in the United States were to say, the president, the Congress, the Senate, your local state authorities, all of them will completely shut down. The police officers are gone. All public order has broken. The lights have gone out. World War I was often described as the time that the lights went out in Europe. Well, this is the lights going out for Jerusalem. At that time, the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and all the nations of the earth will mourn. They will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And he will, hang on, did you notice something? He talks about at that time, we're in a transition period now in this passage. It'll really transmute into the other answer here. The transition moves from question 1 to question 2. But remember I said that you could say that there was a third question about the coming of the Son of Man? That one's right here. Although we've really eaten up our time for today, I'm going to ask you to give me a little bit more time so we can close this one out. This judgment comes in the sky. The nations of the earth will mourn. They will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. He will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and he will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other. Now, some people say that this is something they call the rapture. But the word rapture is not even found in the Bible. And I would submit to you that the concept is not either. That's going to bother a few of you. So I'm going to let you hang on to that for a week before we really talk more about it. Fact is, the Bible is not entirely precise about how God will end the present order of things and what he will do at the end of the age. And any of us that try to take our pens and papers and make a little graph of God will do this, then he will do that, then he will do that, are making a horrible mistake. Number one, we're trying to write things that the Bible did not write. Number two, we're trying to direct God as if we're directing a play. When God acts outside of physics and therefore outside of time, and as C.S. Lewis put it so brilliantly in Mere Christianity, we live in a world of this, then that. God does not. He lives in the present and in the past. He interprets what he wants to do and moves forward for future. All of these things are outside of our ability to understand. So all we can do is embrace the mystery. We're going to stop here because, again, time is getting short and the landscapers are coming by with all of the leaf blowers. So I hope you've had a good week, and I hope that you tune in next week. If you like these, please share them with others. This is the least watched of our 3 videos every week and has been for most of our 4 years. So if you can help spread the love, that would be very nice. Enjoy.